Deep inside the castle was a locked room no servant dared enter. The king only opened it during negotiations, and each time he emerged, his face looked as though he had aged months in minutes. Some said the room contained relics that warned rulers of alliances doomed to fail. Others claimed the chamber responded to lies. Stay, and you'll discover the dark political machinery behind medieval royal marriages, the omens, the rituals, and the unsettling truths kings relied on to keep their empires from collapsing. If you enjoy this dark histories, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious to know where this story reach. In the shadowed halls of medieval kingdoms, where torches flickered against stone walls and whispers carried farther than footsteps. Marriage was never a bond of affection, but a weapon sharpened by ambition, and kings moved through their courts knowing every promise, every handshake, every union sealed across banquet tables, was a thread woven into the fabric of power, a fabric that could either hold an empire together or split it apart with a single misstep. And so when kings spoke of marriage, they weren't speaking of individuals at all, but of territories, alliances, defenses, and futures that stretched beyond their own lifetimes. Because in a world ruled by fear of invasion, betrayal, and shifting loyalties, a wedding was often the only treaty that did not require an army to enforce, and this reality forged some of the most unsettling political marriages in history. Marriages arranged long before the individuals involved understood the forces shaping their destinies, and the kings who arranged them believed themselves protectors of order, though the methods they used were tangled with superstition, tradition, and the relentless pressure to secure bloodlines strong enough to withstand the unpredictable tides of war, famine, and rebellion. And whenever a royal marriage was announced, the air in the castle changed, carrying an unspoken tension. For everyone knew such news meant negotiations had taken place in shadowed chambers, where the scent of wax and aging parchment mingled with the weight of decisions no one could reverse. And in these dim rooms, kings spoke plainly about territory lines drawn by marriage oaths, about alliances sealed through shared lineage, about rival families pacified by binding their futures together. And while the world outside celebrated royal unions as symbols of peace, those within the palace understood the darker truth. A marriage was a contract carved from necessity, not sentiment, and every kingdom relied on it to survive. And it was this backdrop of unending political urgency that created a tradition where rulers looked less at compatibility and more at opportunity. And opportunity in medieval eyes meant shaping the future before the future had the chance to shape them. And so royal families entered negotiations early, long before alliances hardened or dissolved, because waiting too long risked losing everything. And across Europe the custom grew. Alliances were planted early like seeds thrown into uncertain soil, expected to grow into stability years down the line. And kings observing this practice felt not only justified but pressured to follow. For any ruler who failed to secure alliances risked watching neighboring kingdoms strengthen around him while his own influence thinned like worn cloth. And the eerie thing about these arrangements was not only their strategic roots but the rituals that accompanied them. Rituals that existed long before diplomacy had formal rules. Rituals that turned political agreements into something resembling fate. For when two royal houses agreed to unite, heralds carried the message through corridors lined with symbols representing ancestors whose legacies weighed upon every decision, and as the announcement spread through the castle, courtiers walked differently, as though mindful of being observed by figures who were no longer living but lingered through memory and myth, and the castle priests prepared ceremonies believed to hold supernatural significance, whispering that unions tied by political necessity required spiritual reinforcement to keep them from unraveling. And this belief birthed practices that would seem strange to the modern world. Practices where offerings were placed before ancient relics, where candles were lit before rooms that had been sealed for generations, where kings consulted advisors who called themselves interpreters of omens rather than strategists. Because the medieval mind existed in a world where politics and the supernatural lived side by side. And even the most hardened ruler hesitated to ignore signs that seemed to echo warnings from forces beyond his understanding. And perhaps that is why kings spoke so cautiously when discussing marriages, lowering their voices not because they feared spies, but because they feared speaking too boldly in the presence of unseen influences, believing a careless word could shift the favor of fate. And so negotiations unfolded like rituals, slow, deliberate, surrounded by symbolism and unspoken superstition, with envoys traveling between kingdoms carrying scrolls that held not only agreements, but expectations passed down through generations. And these envoys understood they were transporting the future, a future heavy enough to alter borders, treaties, and dynasties. And when two kings finally reached an agreement, bells rang from towers not in celebration, but in acknowledgement, as though the castle itself recognized the significance of the decision, and the people, unaware of the negotiations that shaped their fate, filled the streets with murmurs and speculation, for they knew marriages meant alliances, and alliances meant either safety or tension, depending on the history between the families involved, and the courtiers who observed from balconies recognized something deeper, that rulers did not marry for affection, companionship, or sentiment. They married to survive, to strengthen bloodlines, to secure influence, and sometimes if fear pressed enough weight upon their decisions to prevent wars that could swallow their kingdoms whole. And this fear drove kings to seek alliances as early as possible, believing that binding families together before conflict emerged offered the best protection against unforeseen threats. And it was in this climate of urgency that entire dynasties were formed. Dynasties built not on personal choice, but on strategic calculation, and within these calculations lay a chilling truth. The fate of nations rested on alliances formed long before the individuals involved ever understood the roles they were destined to play, roles shaped not by desire but by duty. And as centuries passed, these traditions solidified into accepted custom, so deeply rooted in politics and superstition that even kings who privately questioned the morality of such arrangements felt powerless to challenge the system that had sustained empires for generations. And thus the cycle continued, each marriage creating a new chain in a lineage that stretched across Europe, connecting houses through alliances that determined the rise and fall of kingdoms. And the deeper one looks into these political unions, the clearer the pattern becomes. Power first, stability second, tradition third, and personal will, somewhere far behind, overshadowed by the relentless demands of ruling a world where every decision had consequences that rippled through borders like waves across a dark sea. And this is where our deeper journey begins, inside palaces where strategy whispered louder than affection, where every union was a gamble against chaos, and where kings believed that marriages arranged early, arranged deliberately, arranged according to necessity, were the only shield strong enough to protect their kingdoms from the unforgiving uncertainty of medieval life. As time passed within the stone corridors of medieval courts, the consequences of early alliances began to ripple through every aspect of royal life, shaping not only diplomacy but the very architecture of power. And rulers soon realized that securing a marriage agreement early did more than protect the present. It shaped the future with an iron grip, locking two kingdoms together before either had the chance to drift toward rival interests. And because uncertainty governed medieval politics more fiercely than any written law, kings treated these alliances like fortresses, structures meant to be built early, fortified constantly, and protected at all costs. And this need for security fueled a sense of urgency that settled over royal courts like a permanent mist, a reminder that hesitation invited vulnerability, and vulnerability invited intrusion. For the medieval world was not built on trust, but on negotiation, suspicion, and the constant awareness that shifting alliances could unravel a kingdom faster than an invading army ever could. And so when rulers looked at the families surrounding their thrones, they didn't see individuals but strategic connections waiting to be forged, and these connections had to be secured before rival powers stepped in with offers of their own, for to delay meant risking allegiance falling into the hands of a competing dynasty. And this competition created an environment where decisions were made with both calculation and superstition, where kings balanced political advantage with omens interpreted by priests, astrologers, and advisors, who spent their lives studying patterns the modern world would dismiss as coincidence. Yet to medieval rulers, these patterns were warnings, signs, and directives from forces they believed governed not just their reigns, but the fate of their kingdoms. And because of this belief, every negotiation began with ritual, whether spoken or unspoken, with kings lighting candles in chambers stained by centuries of decisions, placing their hands upon relics said to carry the weight of ancestral guidance, and waiting in silence until they felt assured, or at least convinced, that the path before them was aligned with both earthly strategy and the intangible influence of fate. And once negotiations began, the rulers involved spoke through envoys, through letters written with deliberate phrasing and sealed with wax that bore the insignia of a dynasty whose survival depended on the words contained within. And these letters traveled across borders, carried through forests, mountains, and villages by messengers, aware that a single lost scroll could shift the balance of Europe. For agreements were fragile until confirmed, and rivals watched for any hesitation or delay to exploit. and whenever a proposed alliance reached another court, the receiving ruler weighed it heavily, pacing through cold chambers lined with tapestries depicting ancestors whose legacies demanded preservation. And as he paced, his advisors whispered about the geopolitical landscape shaping the horizons, which kingdoms were strengthening through treaties, which families were weakening through internal disputes, which dynasties had produced strong heirs, and which had not for lineage. Strength mattered as much as military power in a world where blood determined authority. And once a ruler accepted an alliance, the next phase of the ritual unfolded, a phase far less visible to the world, yet far more influential, occurring in rooms silent except for the scratching of quills across parchment as scribes drafted terms that intertwined the destinies of two houses. And these terms contained not only agreements but expectations, promises of mutual defense, trade privileges, boundary assurances, and, perhaps most importantly, loyalty. A word that held a different meaning in medieval courts, meaning not affection or trust but obligation enforced by the threat of political isolation. For kingdoms without alliances were vulnerable. And vulnerability in those times meant instability waiting to be exploited by ambitious rivals. And so kings pushed these agreements forward with urgency, sometimes even impatience, for they understood that the window between opportunity and threat was narrow, and hesitation allowed adversaries to maneuver, to negotiate competing alliances, to strengthen their positions while weakening the influence of those who delayed. And these pressures created an atmosphere within courts that felt almost tangible, a tension stretching across great halls, echoing through corridors, settling in quiet conversations among advisors who understood the stakes far more deeply than the public ever would. And as agreements solidified, rituals took shape within the castle, preparing for the formal sealing of alliances. And though these rituals differed from kingdom to kingdom, they shared a common theme, symbolism woven into every gesture, every garment, every word spoken aloud. For medieval culture believed symbols carried power, power to reinforce agreements, power to influence fate, power to align earthly decisions with the invisible realm rulers feared and revered in equal measure. And so during these rituals, kings stood before their courts wearing ceremonial robes that represented not just authority but continuity, a reminder that they were not acting alone but on behalf of dynasties stretching backward through time and forward through generations yet to come. And as they spoke their commitments, the air in the hall often grew still, as though history itself paused to listen, for the decisions made in those moments would shape borders, influence wars, and determine alliances that would outlast the people who forged them. And once the rituals concluded, the public celebration began, though the true significance of the event remained known only to the inner circle. For while courtiers danced and musicians played and villagers filled the streets with festivities, the rulers understood the deeper meaning of what had transpired, and that meaning was simple yet powerful. Stability, however temporary, had been secured, and for a medieval king, temporary stability was often the only kind available, and it was enough to keep the realm balanced between order and chaos. And yet beneath the outward celebration there remained an undercurrent of unease, for everyone in the ruling class knew alliances were double-edged, binding houses together but also creating obligations that could pull kingdoms into conflicts they had not chosen. And this awareness cast a long shadow over even the most advantageous unions, reminding rulers that in the medieval world, peace earned through political marriage was fragile, contingent, and vulnerable to being disrupted by shifting loyalties, unexpected events, or the relentless ambition of rival dynasties. And so kings lived in a state of constant vigilance, sleeping lightly, reading omens carefully, consulting advisors regularly, and hoping the alliances they secured early would withstand the unpredictable storms of political turmoil, waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. And as we move deeper into this story, the motives, fears, and hidden strategies behind these unions become clearer, revealing a medieval world where marriage was less about companionship and far more about the intricate dance of power, influence, and the perpetual struggle to maintain control over realms that threatened to fracture at any moment beneath the weight of history.